Welcome to a new episode of my RPG podcast. It's been a while because I've been busy with a lot of work, but it's good to be back. And with today's guest, Ross Watson. Ross has done an incredible amount of stuff in the tabletop sphere, as well as the video game sphere, from Darksiders to Star Wars, Dark Heresy, and most recently, Warhammer 40k RPG system. The audio here is a little bit reverby, and for those of you who know audio, taking out reverb from recording is kind of like unmixing paint. Can't really do that, but it's a fantastic interview nonetheless, so I hope you enjoy. Welcome one and all to a new episode of MyRPG podcast. Today's guest is Ross Watson. Ross, will you please introduce yourself?
Hello, everybody. I am Ross Watson, and I am pleased to introduce myself here on the show. Don, thanks for having me on.
Thank you, Ross, for coming on.
I think people probably might know me best from games that I've worked on, like Star Wars: Edge of the Empire, Savage Rifts, Torg Eternity, and my new thing, which is Warhammer 40k Roleplay, Wrath and Glory. Yeah,
I mean, you've got quite the resume, and we were going to jump into all of that in just 1 second, but you always have to start at the beginning. So, Ross, what was kind of your introduction to RPGs growing up?
My dad was, actually. He had played Dungeons & Dragons in college, and he thought it was really cool. So when I was a kid and just showing an interest in fantasy novels, he said, you should really get into this game, and he bought me the Metzner Redbox edition. I think it was 82 or 83, and I was off and running and never looked back.
That must have been fantastic. And did you have like a group of friends who you were playing with every weekend? Like, how frequently were you playing with that? And also, was it acceptable when you started playing at the time, or was it still kind of that weird niche satanic scare?
As far as how often I played it as often as I possibly could. I probably annoyed a lot of my friends at that age by going, can we play again? Let's play some more. It was definitely not very acceptable. We moved to the Deep South, actually, not too long after I got introduced to the game. And I ran into a number of occasions where people would say to me, that's the devil's game, right? Oh, my gosh. There was definitely a stigma attached to it. I remember in high school, there was a PTA meeting that we attended, which was about the occult and the dangers of which, and it included things like, Ouija boards and Dungeons and Dragons. And, I mean, it was just laughably old-fashioned for them to be worried about that kind of a thing.
And it kind of sucks that you guys had that at what I think would be the perfect time to get into any RPGs when you're a kid, where you don't necessarily have, the full-time job, and you have all the ability to be like, hey, let's all spend the night and play for a 10-hour session or something like that. That seems like the perfect time to get into RPGs.
Well, fortunately, I did have a lot of friends who were really into it, especially junior high and high school, just played, I would say, at least every week, if not sometimes multiple times a week. And we got involved in a bunch of different games. I've talked about this a little bit before, but the games I played the most in junior high and high school, of course, Dungeons & Dragons, which was in 2nd edition at the time, and Star Wars, the West End D6, and Robotech, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and Rifts, which were all the Palladium games, and Jeff Grubb's Marvel Superheroes. Those were our big, just came back to and played over and over again type games.
Were you typically running games, or were you a player, or a bit of both?
Most of the time I was running the game. I was the DM. I did try to get my hand in as a player as often as I could, just because I do love playing as well. But I guess I just gravitated more often to the role of the game master.
So you'd say you kind of have that natural creativity in you, which I find just almost every one of my guests I have who comes on has that kind of tendency. Even if they're not primarily a DM or a GM, the idea of creating at least a character is so satisfying and tittillating.
Well, I would be mowing lawns, because I did a lot of lawn mowing as a job when I was in junior high and high school. And while you're pushing the mower, it's hot. You don't want to be thinking about the mower. right? So I would be thinking about my game and how I was going to run it and what the next plot twist was going to be and what some cool encounters would be and what some fun monsters would be to throw in there. And I mean, it just was, it's fair to say that I was fairly obsessed as a kid, and just kind of kept that obsession through the rest of my life.
Well, yeah. So as your kind of life is going on, you go from starting with your original D&D, and you mentioned, Star Wars and TMNT, Robotech. How far do you keep going with this as a consistent thing? Because I find most people have a little bit of a break in probably the latter high school, early university years, and then they kind of pick it back up as an adult. Did it happen with you?
No, I was pretty consistent. I pretty much everywhere I went, I found a gaming group, and we just kept playing. We switched over to Champions, played a lot of Champions in college, and I just kind of kept going with that. One of the things I brought with me to my college dorm was all of my game books, and I kept going with it. I don't think I've ever had a really long break in where I just haven't been role playing.
And I know when you went with the Army, you continued, and I think, was that where you got into Warhammer?
Yes. So the Army, the guys in the Army, we played a ton of different games. We played BattleTech, we played a lot of miniature, type games because I knew some officers that were playing like Warhammer 40K Epic, right? And it looked cool to me. I always really liked the idea of it. I've been drawn to strategy and tactics games quite a bit, and I said, it'd be fun would be to try that out. And these guys that were living above me in the apartment above me, actually, we were playing Shadowrun so loud that they had to come find out what the hell we were doing. And it turned out they were playing Warhammer upstairs. They were playing 40K directly above me. So we kind of did a trade. I taught them about Shadowrun, they taught me about Warhammer, and I got hooked.
Man, that seems like you've got this amazing sort of arc here of just consistently picking up new and fun games and expanding. So since you are DMing a lot and doing stuff and creating your own stuff just coming naturally, are you entire time while you're running any of these mini systems going oh, well, maybe if we did this differently, or if I house ruled this, or I created this mechanic, where does the self-publishing kind of seeds come from? Was it your 40K, Warhammer days, or what was it?
Actually, Champions was the place I first started doing a lot of tinkering. Champions is very much, the hero system in general, is very much a tinkerer's game. It encourages you to build the way that the powers work and the effects work and the way the gear works. It doesn't really give you a gun. You're supposed to build that gun. How many shots does it have? How does the effect work when you shoot someone? That kind of a thing. And from a toolbox perspective, that just got me thinking more and more about game design and the way that games were handling things. A lot of experimental stuff had come out around that time as well. I'd gotten into Torg, although I didn't understand it at the time, and I was seeing things cropping up like Ghostbusters, and there were just a lot of interesting games that had come along with different ways to handle rules. And of course, there was that period where everything was super hyper realistic. There were games we model it accurately. And I found that I didn't really care for that as much as I did for games that modeled it in a more fun way. And I don't know, starting with Champions and going from there, I started to look at ways to, there were always house rules and things like that. And I know I've come across game masters have binders, and you're wow, this is an entirely different game at this point. And my thought was always if I'm not going to create it from scratch, I would like to modify, I'd like to tinker under the hood like a car, without changing the chassis, or I want to just build my own car.
And you're starting to pick up all these kind of great skills, which are all these different systems have different kind of takes on mechanics, where some may be disparate sort of style with Warhammer might be way different than what you're running with TNMT or maybe in your Rifts game, but you're still picking up the skills of what works and what doesn't work, and the kind of idea of the implementation behind the mechanics. So when you're creating any sort of content, are you a person who goes oh, well, here's a mechanic or a spark that I think will be fun, like an idea or a plot thread? Is that kind of where you begin? Do you start with the problem or maybe the spark and then go out, or do you do no, I have a giant idea, I'm just going to fill it in top to bottom?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question. I've My friend Sean Fannin, is a guy who's worked on a lot of different game projects. He's the type who will take an existing work, he will take an existing car and he'll add a supercharger to it. And the design of that supercharger is what he enjoys. And I have also found a lot of enjoyment in like taking something and tinkering with it under the hood, like we were talking about. But I've started to study more and more, like, why is that important? There's this study of games, ludology. And I was at Essen last year actually talking about this with some people, that there's a sociological aspect to it too. Like the fun, factor, if you will, of a game is kind of this ephemeral thing that isn't necessarily mathematically expressed. But at the same time, game design does have a lot of different disciplines in it, like math, like sociology, like the understanding of the underlying principles of whether a game is cooperative or competitive. There's just a lot of stuff going on that it's like the difference between a car mechanic and a car engineer. I started to really want to be like, I want to actually like be the engineer now. And yeah, for me, I think there's a lot of game designers who will tell you like they come from a certain space or headspace when they're working on things. For me, that headspace is more or less, I would say, I lean very heavily towards intuition. I lean towards how something feels as opposed to how something mechanically or mathematically, works out. I like to say, this is definitely a far more inflammatory statement, I think, than I probably mean it to sound. But I tend to worship at the altar of fun more than I do at the altar of balance or the altar of mechanical perfection. I want a game that's fun more than one that is fine-tuned mathematically, so to speak. And I think that's
a common thread. That's actually a common thread I've heard in all of the episodes I've done thus and beyond. Like, I constantly have the question that comes up is, how much do you adhere to rules or settings or balance versus the rule of cool? And I think it's funny that there is a little bit of a divide now between people who've gotten into the games recently and people who are kind of more old school. Not to say that you can't have somebody who's old school and is like, fuck the rules, we can have a good time. Or you can't have somebody who's new school who's like, no, we gotta, play by what the as written is. But that's interesting that you mentioned that, because that's the constant debate happening.
Well, this comes up, my Warhammer background actually brings up a lot of this too, because the idea of rules as written versus rules as intended. That's been an ongoing debate for many decades now at this point when it comes to miniature games, especially, or competitive games. I think the Magic players probably have something very similar to that as well.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's interesting because you've also worked in the video game realm. And what I think is interesting about the video game realm is ultimately when we're doing an RPG, even if we have a miniature or some sort of representation on the board, there's still a lot of that stuff that's done in our minds, in our heads, our visualizations of what's going on, or kind of resolving concepts. Whereas in the video game space, it's interesting because you are actually limited by the software compatibilities, and you literally see how that works, and then you can sort of science out what I'm allowed and not allowed to do depending on your inputs. So does that kind of change the way you think about creating a story or creating something, to be like, well, if I can't literally do that or show that on the screen, then maybe I shouldn't write that or create that?
Well, a video game offers a lot of different ways to get a lot of different ways to alter the experience of play. Okay. A role-playing game book, for example, we have to work almost entirely in text. We can do some showing of diagrams. We can do some creative layout work. We can do some really interesting artwork to show you kind of what we're talking about. But for the most part, the way we communicate to you is through text, through explanation, through example. In a video game, you can actually there's been a lot of studies of this, people that are far more knowledgeable than I, so forgive me while I fumble through this description, but there's the idea of the emergent play and experiential awareness and things like that. Just the idea that the game can sort of teach you what it's about through the actions that you take or your avatar takes, through the ambient environment and sound and visuals. There's just so much more going on in a video game as to how I can tell you what it's doing. Of course, it's just not as interactive. Like, that's the advantage that the role-playing game has, is it is widely open-ended, it is widely interactive, it is exactly it will modify itself based on what you do. The advantage of a video game, of course, is that it can also automate a lot of complex systems. You could have a far more complex mathematical stuff going on underneath the hood, because the computer kind of takes care of all that for you. Now, sometimes that can add to the experience. Sometimes it takes away from it. And, my role in video games was primarily towards the narrative end. I was doing mostly the writing of the scripts. I was writing quests. I was writing dialogues and item descriptions and things of that nature. So when it comes to game design, I really it's more what I've studied than more of what I've actually done. Because again, it's just mostly I was on the writing end. But I think there's a lot still to be said about how video games can communicate their aspects of the design. And that way is only going to grow. But they probably, until we get that full VR chip implant, we can just put in our head and, be an instantaneous communication with anyone across the world. Role-playing games are going to be that primary social, this is going to be the most social, the most interactive way to, sort of escape into a game that exists.
And I'm on the actually other side of the fence about the VR, that I never want to get to the full VR jack-in, plug-in Matrix situation, because I think something about a physical relationship with somebody, physically coming to a table, or like even the ritual of having people seated around you who you trust or want to spend hours with. There's something I think so innate to the human experience that losing that is kind of losing a part of humanity. That's another long diatribe later. But what I'm really interested in is actually augmented reality, because one of the things I see all the time, I actually know friends who work in the LARP community who use augmented reality and apps, and they're trying to start stuff, is I would really love to see that implemented more in RPGs as well. Because while we do still live in a lot of the theater of the mind, or we can have that unlimited visuals, because it's mentally visual, you're as good as you can describe or say. Something about the aesthetic of maybe if I cast a fireball or fire a gun at a thing, seeing that represented on my miniature, that's one step up in how much of a release or how much immersion I can get. So I'm super excited in that, actually, when it comes to the virtual space.
Yeah, I agree that there's a lot of potential there that has yet to be fully tapped. So yeah, I can see why cyberpunk stuff is of interest to you, because we could probably have a long conversation about the definition of being physically in the room, if our senses actually tell us it is indistinguishable from actually being there. But let's not get sidetracked.
Yeah, that's probably a larger conversation on a different podcast about what is being human in our virtual avatars and humanity and things like that. But kind of tying us back to RPGs and especially you and your resume. You've got so many things here, from the gaming sphere, the video game sphere, even your own works of fiction. Is it safe to say you're a storyteller through and through? I know there's mechanics involved in game design. I know there's mechanics involved in any sort of structure, working for a company or creating a product. But it seems like ultimately at the end of the day, you want to tell a story. Is that true?
Well, this goes back to that whole idea of the game as experience. You could make the argument that some games are just a story, some experiences are just a story, some are larger and more important than that. You take a game like Minecraft, there really is no story there. The story is just you building, it's experiential. You are making the things, and that's what that game is all about. I definitely think of myself first and foremost as a storyteller, but I do also feel like a large part of my identity is a game designer. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that sometimes you can design a game that doesn't necessarily have to do with telling stories. Or at least that's not, it's a different definition of that than other people might assume.
So I'm somebody who comes from a strong, I have to admit my bias. I come from a strong storytelling aspect. So even when I play a game, I don't know if you've ever heard Rocket League, all right?
Oh, yeah, RC, yeah, of course.
Oh, okay. So RC car soccer, right? Is basically what Rocket League is.
Yeah.
I'm way more excited and willing to tell my friends about this amazing back and forth battle, and you pull it from behind, or you win at the last second, or you nail that last goal. That's still my experience is manipulating a car or a joystick or whatever. But it's the story of the rise and the fall, the stealing success from the jaws of defeat sort of scenario. So I've always viewed, even inside of the experience, something like Minecraft, where you're saying there's no story, there's experience there. But the story you end up telling your friend is oh man, I was building this amazing cat. I was building this giant 100 block cat, and all of a sudden I turn around and there's a whole bunch of freakers and creepers, and I'm like, oh god, I'm gonna die, and I have to bat them off and shoot all of them in the head like Legolas. Like, there's an innate storytelling thing that happens when you relate the experience. Then just let me tell you about the mechanics or the system, because I can. So again, this is just me with my own personal opinion here. I think it's interesting because I think that's still storytelling in and of itself. I've had great experiences, like being into a very fast car or a roller coaster, but it's the story of that ups and downs and the way it made me feel and how I almost wanted to throw up.
Okay, you have a good point there, that that the story is more than the story is a personal experiential thing as well as a what's presented to you. So yeah, absolutely, I agree with you on that.
So what's your favorite thing then? Okay, since I know you've done role playing, I know you've done fiction, I know a tabletop, and then video game, and then fiction, and I know you're working on a whole bunch of stuff, and we're gonna get into the new 40K stuff too. But can I make you choose one of your favorite children? What's kind of your preference? Is it possible?
Oh my God.
I won't tell the other kids. I won't tell the other kids.
Sure. Well, it's a thing that kind of crosses over a lot of these things. So we talk about, telling stories. So I love telling stories. It's just a different ways of getting that across. And right now, like at this specific moment in time, my favorite thing is probably doing that through the lens of something like fiction. I like the idea of studying the craft of writing and finding ways to get those ideas across through character and conflict and world building and stuff like that. Now, again, a lot of that is crossing over to other disciplines, but yeah.
And I mean, who would you say are your biggest fiction kind of role models or inspirations?
Oh, okay. That's an interesting point. I read a ton of books by a lot of different people, but I have some favorites. I really love Brandon Sanderson and Brian McClellan. I really love Scott Sigler and Scott Finch. Those guys are both really, really, really talented dudes. There's just a lot of really Drew Hayes. I would actually really, really mention Drew Hayes as a big influence on me. His writing is astoundingly good. It never fails to inspire me.
It's a good set of influences you got there. So I can kind of piece the things together now. I'm like, okay, I see where this is all coming.
A lot of those guys did game writing. Scott Lynch and Scott Sigler both wrote for role-playing games, for example.
And that's what I think is so interesting is I've seen this kind of transition in some figures to writing fiction, nonfiction, or just, non-tabletop RPG stuff. And there's a part of me that likes to make the old joke of like, he just got tired of the players not doing what he wanted to do. So now he can control all the instruments and actually make it play out the way he wants. Because we all had that amazing
DM syndrome. Yeah.
Yeah. You all had that amazing, like, for me, it's either that great, like, story point or character, or sometimes of like, oh man, if you went left, I was so ready to do this that I sometimes, I will jokingly after a TPK, I'll do the postmortem, in which case I get to spew out all of my, like, guys, there was all these amazing arcs and these things I wanted to do, and if you went right instead of left, you were going to do this, and I was going to kill you and do this. And I always felt like that was probably more for me than for them. I think that was just a part of me being like, I waited a year and a half, damn it, I need to get this off my chest.
That may in fact be true. I couldn't say for those guys, but definitely a lot of inspiration for the things that I would love to write comes from games or ideas that I've had while doing games. So, have
you ever ported over characters or ideas from games and systems? Oh, all right.
Yeah, actually, there's a novella on Amazon right now called Pirate's Oath, which is based on my setting of Accursed for Savage Worlds. And the main character and the things that he does, a lot of that is based on like the mechanics and the setting that we wrote for that.
It's brilliant. See, like, ultimately, I'm never going to call myself a writer or a story. I call myself a storyteller. I'm never going to call myself a writer though, because I found as much as I enjoy the world building aspect of it, I have such more reverence for the people who actually write and create the structure to it, because I think there's a distinct difference between us who run our own homebrew campaigns and create our own homebrew rules and characters, which is fine and dandy, but ultimately they're in this world with the created sort of I'm trying to pen the term here. I'm trying to figure it out, but like intentional staticism, because I think when you're writing any sort of story, and you can tell me if I'm wrong here, you introduce a character with a way to have them supplement the plot, right? There's an intent that they're here for. There's a ultimate goal that they're going to push the reader towards, either supplying some information or a great revelation or something to be a threat. Whereas a lot of the stuff we do with DMs and GMs and stuff is sometimes just BS, or be like, fuck, well, something's got to be there, so I'm just going to throw this together without any kind of idea to the general arc or flow of the story. In which case, I don't think you can truly be a writer in that regard. You're not a writer. You're more of just a amazing improviser.
Well, I think that the discipline of DMing really has a lot of different aspects to it. Improvisation is a big deal, of course, but there's a lot going on there, and I would definitely never say that someone who's a really good DM doesn't know how to tell a good story. So,
I'm not saying that, but I'm saying is like I'm very pointed for myself to be like, I'm not a writer. I may have been creating a world for years on end with my friends, and like, yeah, I could technically put this together, I think, and maybe make a story of it about these factions and religions and idols and civilizations, but at the same time, like, it's still it's still under the box of like, these are things created because we were playing a game and you needed, there needs to be a guild that can give you a task or a quest, or there needs to be this that can give you that. Whereas like, I did not create these things to be like, there's an overarching story that needs to be told, and each of these are like that's the point I was trying to make.
Okay, sorry, yeah. Well, the craft of telling a story, though, is independent from the idea that you put together for it. Okay, I believe this. I believe this to be true. I think you can take any idea, and if you're a good storyteller, if you have the craft down, you can make a great story out of it. The pieces and parts that come together, it's cool that they're there, but inspiration can literally come from anywhere. Ray Bradbury was often saying, he just would look around his office, and that's where he would get ideas for a lot of his stories. And famously, there's the bet that was made with Jim Butcher regarding whether he could turn a crazy idea into a really good book series, and he did, which is the Codex Alera series. And the idea that was handed him was Pokemon plus Lost Roman Legion, and he made that awesome. So it's. Yeah, the locations and the inspiration may come from something that was put together for an entirely different purpose, but that doesn't mean you can't say, okay, and now I can find a way to put that into a great story. I actually think that's an interesting challenge. I think that kind of makes me look at telling stories a slightly different way now, as I might look at some of the game events and say, okay, well, that's cool and it happened, but what if I was telling the viewpoint of the guy selling cabbages on the corner while this was going on? That might be interesting.
Yeah, that actually leads me into another thing I was going to ask. You've worked on other people's properties, and including making your own property. I've got to ask you though, when you're working on somebody else's property or IP, is it a little bit of a challenge to be like, well, there's an established lore, world, or system, and there's a Bible that I need to, abide by? Because
absolutely.
Yeah. So I was going to ask. So like, I've talked to comic book writers who've said that some of them are like, well, hey, if I'm playing in the Marvel wheelhouse or the DC wheelhouse, there's only so much you can do to Batman or Superman or Wonder Woman, whatever. Whereas other people will say, I love that challenge because I have now parameters. So how much can I flex inside of these parameters? I have a structure, which some people like that structure because it points them in a direction.
Yeah, I think there's definitely that appeal on both sides. There's the appeal of working with the established IP, and I've been really lucky. I've been very fortunate to work on things like Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and Warhammer 40K and Rifts, things like that. So yeah, I've got a lot of experience working within a particular world, a particular IP, and fitting into that box. And sometimes the challenge is being able to create something new and interesting within a box that's been very well well traveled before. And other times, like you say, it's the challenge is sort of like, well, how can I use this structure to my advantage and build something, that kind of go deeper or pull back a little to see something that hasn't been seen before in this area. So it is definitely it's definitely a different approach when you have to work with an IP, established IP, and I think that it changes your priorities too, because when you're working with an IP, like the number one goal for me has always been to make it feel like the thing that I'm working on. Like if I'm working on Star Wars, it needs to feel like Star Wars. If I'm working on Lord of the Rings, it needs to feel like Lord of the Rings. And when I'm working on 40K, it has to feel like 40K. That becomes your top priority, and it does change the way that you approach something creatively.
True, and I think not to say like obviously creating your own thing is super rewarding because it's your own thing, but as a comic book guy, like Ed Brubaker's take on Captain America or Frank Miller's run with Batman, like has become so definitive to what that character is. Like it doesn't undo the previous renditions of the character, but what they did with it when they worked inside those parameters, they still created something that we know now for the rest of all time. We know that's an ode to the way Frank Miller introduced these concepts, or an ode to Brubaker or Neil Gaiman or whoever the writer was underneath that IP. So,
Paul
that's
Dini and the animated Batman, of course, being a huge, just extremely influential and consistently put together look at certain characters and things. For example, I totally get that. This is something we've talked a lot about, obviously. I think that if you're able to make your mark on an established IP like Frank Miller or Brubaker, then that is a great accomplishment. It is very meaningful. Like I said, we're talking about the challenge of working in an IP. I think there's an achievement that can be made there, whereas you can say, well, anybody can make their own guy, right? And it's just about the craft. Like, how well do you tell that story? That's great, but there's kind of an extra hurdle if you're trying to tell a story with the established IP as opposed to doing something on your own, because it's slightly harder. But you do also have the support of not only the built-in fan base, but a built-in continuity in history. You don't have to establish an origin story, for example. So I don't know. It's like it's a 6 of one, half a dozen the other kind of situation there.
Yeah, and I always thought it's while nothing close to what you do, I always like the idea of whenever I'm playing a role-playing game and if somebody's trying to explain a concept to me, if they go, like how with like Jedi this, or do you know how with like this ninja, like and like, yes, I completely get it, because it's that understood sort of contract that we have between each other. Like that's the mechanic, that's the idea, that's the MO, the mythos, the pathos, and you express a concept. It's iconography. It's modern day mythology. You express this concept across each of our individual experiences just by referencing that character. And I think that's kind of sounds like what you're also pulling from if you're working with somebody else's IP.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I mean, I love the way you just said that, because it is sometimes a lot easier to get someone to understand what you're talking about by using a shortcut to another IP or an existing story or an existing character. Like I could tell you, for example, that the accursed setting is basically Hellboy meets Solomon Kane, right? And
I can get that now.
Right? Yeah, that instantly conjures in your head like kind of what it's about. And I could do the same thing for a number of different settings, and that sometimes that's a really great way to get something across. I have found that other times it can be a little challenging to try to explain. Like, for example, Drew Hayes, this guy I was talking about earlier, this author, he wrote a series of books that are just like fantastic. And the only way that I can really tell you what they're about is going to also maybe not make you want to read them, which is weird, but it's basically like Hogwarts, but for superheroes. And I know, right? Like that is not at all like what the book is about, but at the same time, it's the easiest way for me to tell you without going into a great deal of depth as to what those books are about. That's his super powered books, just FYI. So sometimes, it's a great tool it's a handy thing to be able to say, yes, it's like the Jedi, except the Force is, alive or sentient, I should say. For example, if you're going to try to get across the idea of something to someone, that would be a great way to do it, is to give them a touchstone of something that they've already built on. And IPs are exactly that. Although, again, like if you wanted to communicate something like the Force but alive, you'd have to. There's a lot of hoops you'd have to jump through to make that work in Star Wars because they're very established ways of how the Force works and things like that. Anyway,
True.
Yeah, but the great conversation, dude. You definitely are hitting a lot of interesting ways about communicating the essence of a story or a conflict or a setting, which are all important things to me.
Well, I will take that as a great compliment because you're an accomplished guy, so that means a lot to me. I have to think working in the accounting world and working at a place where I can put in earbuds, so I get to listen to a lot of I was an escapist guy from way early on, escapist website, and all those guys like Extra Credits, and I've always been interested in this type of stuff because I think it informs me as a human being, not only just as like a GM of some dudes who come over on Mondays to hang out with me. So I appreciate that. But I also wanted to say one thing because I always get so jazzed whenever hearing people talk about that. Does the 14-year-old you ever take a step back and go, dude, I've worked for fucking Star Wars. Like,
I know,
I've worked with these amazing, like, what is my life?
Yeah, my 12-year-old self is a very happy kid. That's true. And it is very refreshing to sometimes take a step back from the minutia and the drudgery sometimes of what you have to do to get certain things done and recapture that sense of wonder. Actually, that's the idea of a sense of wonder and communicating that in a role-playing game has become something of discussion of late because, our pop culture is definitely filled with fantasy and sci-fi, and that's good. That's a really great thing. But at the same time, it does change. I don't know if you put your mind back into the 60s, right? You got all these major cultural shifts going on, and Lord of the Rings comes out and it is just blowing people's minds. They're like, wow, this is an amazing fantasy world. And that love of Tolkien's creation leads directly to things like Dungeons and Dragons. And then that too is a mind-blowing thing because people are suddenly like, okay, now I can, I can put myself and immerse myself in this fantastical thing that I really love. But now we're in a situation like currently in the 2018, 2019 era, we are in a place where if you want to immerse yourself in something like Fallout, you can for hours, right? You just do it.
Yeah, you can segment and almost live in that
right.
Selective reality, sort of. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So the escapism offered by a role-playing game is not as fundamentally. I don't know. Yeah, I guess I'm losing track of the way I'm trying to say this, but
what I'm picking up, what I'm picking up is you can't shock as much anymore, or you can't so you lose novelty, you lose the ability to be like, I'm thirsting for the next Star Wars thing because recently there's been one every year, so you never had that. Right. You've never had that build, that big release of like, oh my God, it's going to come. Here it is. I was just hit with that. That's everything I ever wanted. Right. When it becomes predictable, and actually, this is funny how like aspects of my life are coming back later in my life. When I was writing an album, I self-produced and wrote 2 albums with my band Warrior when I was in high school. A progressive heavy metal band. Think Rush and Genesis meets Metallica, and you've got the idea, right? That's my using IPs to
with fewer lawsuits, I am assuming.
Absolutely, way fewer lawsuits. That's why we're instrumental, because you can't sue us, at least lyrically and vocally. No, but the thing we were always having an argument over was whenever you'd make something that was reminiscent of or sounded like, we were always talking to each other about like, well, immediately right there, we're showing like, okay, we're fanboys of this band. We're fanboys of that band. This is that type of idea. This is that type of thing. Will never sound original. That was a dreaded summer of ours right before we went to recording. We were listening to all their stuff, and I'm like, I can pick out all of our influences. This is horrible. We're just, pretty much, we're just pretty much kids who are spoofing, our favorite artists. And it came down to a thing my friend Matt told me, which is like, basically like, there's no such thing as a new recipe. It's like, does not matter. Like, nobody creates a new ingredient or a new fruit. It's just the way you mix it. Your chicken parm might be, different than my chicken parm or whatever. Like, I forget which mac and cheese or something I used was the example. But You're right. I cannot in an age like today really shock you unless I go really, really far to the most obscure thing and maybe pull influences from that. But I think my mix of the same influences we have, the same, either modern mythology or symbolism can be done in such a way that it feels like a new flavor.
Well, yeah, I've got a gaming group that I run D&D for here in town, and some of them are players that haven't done a lot of gaming before. They're kind of new. And for me, I really want to make this like a special game. I want their sessions to be something that they, remember going, wow, that was really cool and interesting. That's kind of my goal as a game master. And I found that it's definitely a challenge for me now. And maybe it's just, I'm not as good as I think I am, or I am having, more distractions this time or not. I don't know. But I find that for me, one of the challenges is finding a way to communicate that sense of awe and wonder in a fantasy setting, just because I feel like, you've got a point. There is no such thing as a good recipe, as a new recipe. They've all been told before. But I think awareness of it is just now greater than it has been in a long time. And that's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. But it does make it, I think, sometimes more challenging to get people to go, wow, around the table. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be kind of a bane of any sort of content creator moving forward, is the idea we live in the world where anything can be found and consumed within a matter of moments, thanks to digital media and interfacing in the internet and stuff like that. But I think the one thing, me personally, I find at the very end of it all is the individual's experience, the fact that they can create or be part of something. I hope that never goes away. The same way in like when you go to a concert, regardless of how high definition somebody's phone is, just that atmosphere and that energy of being around people, I think that's the thing that will survive. And regardless of whether it's the first or 12th time, I think that's more important. That's what I hope. Otherwise, we're all doomed.
Yes. Well, I was saying,
the monkeys.
Yeah, whoever inherits the earth, maybe they will do it better. Who knows?
Yeah.
But cool. Well, yeah, that's all really good information and good topics to talk about when it comes to gaming and the experience of it. And this has been a really fascinating conversation about those topics.
Hey, I appreciate it, man. So let's talk about what we're doing recently and what you've been up to. I know you're running out all the conventions and doing all the stuff, the Gen Cons and whatnot. But let's talk about how the new 40K Warhammer 40K. Let me use the proper English here. The new Warhammer 40K. Would your game? You were the lead game designer on this, right?
Correct. It's called Wrath and Glory. It is the new version of Warhammer 40K roleplay. Warhammer 40K roleplay started back in 2008 with Dark Heresy, Rogue Trader, Deathwatch, etc. And then it is new form is now with Ulysses North America, and they picked up the license in 2017, and I've been working on it since then with the creation of this new game. And Wrath and Glory is a dice pool game. We use a lot of D6 dice pools, kind of inspired by a lot of Star Wars stuff back in the day. I feel like it's definitely a more simpler, easy to understand system, and it runs faster than some of the earlier iterations of Warhammer 40K roleplay. But, that's not to say that they were bad. It's just, this is the iterations and the advancements in mechanics that have come along have kind of led us towards prioritizing, things that run quickly and are easy to learn and don't require a lot of looking things up in the book. So that was always our goal with Wrath and Glory. But we have a different universe really to take part in, because Warhammer 40K as a setting has changed slightly recently with the introduction of this idea called the Dark Imperium, basically a warp storm to split the galaxy in half. And one side is cut off from all of the vast resources of the Imperium of Man. And that means those are entire systems that are isolated and under threat from all kinds of attacks. And they require different groups of heroes than before. There's times when you can have desperate allies banding together to sort of troubleshoot dangerous problems or to run off an incoming threat that you wouldn't ordinarily see in Warhammer 40K. It's given us a license to do a pretty broad look at the setting and allow people to play a lot of different types of characters they haven't been able to play before. Orcs and Eldar are both things you can play in Wrath and Glory, and we're just adding more and more as we go. We had our big launch this year at Gen Con, and the books, we had a big pre-order, I think, right before, and the books are going to be shipping out to the backers of that. I believe they're on their way any day now. Don't ask me for specifics. I'm not in charge of the shipping of all that. But right on the heels of that, we're working on the first expansion, which is going to be about the Imperium Nihilus, or the Dark Imperium, and it's going to have a lot of new character options for Imperial characters, and we have some new character creation things that'll add a lot of flavor. We have some great resources for the game master for additional tools and rules and things of that nature. And we've dived deep into our own personal setting, which is this system of worlds called the Gilead system. That is where we have set the majority of our adventures and goings on so far. It's actually a creation of Aaron Dembski-Bowden, who's a really well-known Black Library author for a lot of 40K fans, and he was just super excited to kind of build this setting for us. So it's really cool. If there's your friends that are Warhammer 40K fans are just going to love it. I'm almost certain. And when we get this, the Imperium Niles campaign book is going to have a ton of material on this setting. I think people are going to really dig it.
And you mentioned kind of less having to look up rules and things like that. Warhammer does have this kind of perspective or perception of being something that's a lot more strict and rigid and very precise. And was that a decision that was made based off of feedback, or was that just something that came from the top of like, we want this to run faster?
It was my prerogative. I was a guy who was deeply involved in a lot of the Warhammer 40K roleplay from the Fantasy Flight Games days, which that game was very crunchy. It was very complex in certain ways. Mm-hmm. It used a percentile system, and there's nothing wrong with that. It was a great system. It worked fine for what it needed to do. But we did struggle in a lot of ways to simplify. We struggled in a lot of ways to make the scale work sometimes with the difference between, say, an Imperial Guardsman's rifle versus a Titan, which is this 100-meter tall war machine. So it had its limitations. So when we were working on Wrath and Glory, one of my goals was to say, let's find a way to make this system run smoother, run more with less front-loaded system mastery required. Make it easier for new players to learn, and also just cut down on looking things up in the book. Flipping back and forth in the books was one of the weaknesses of the percentile system, and so we've put a lot of that information on card decks. If you want, you can just have the card deck, handy next to you. We've tried to put as much of the important stuff on the character sheet as possible. You typically, once you get the rules down, and if you want to grab a few of those card sets, you probably won't have to look things up in the book too often at all. I think a lot of people who play Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition know exactly what I'm talking about. That's kind of the goal. That was one of the goalposts I had in mind, was to do something fairly close to the way that they've simplified and smoothed out their system to where it's easier to understand and run than ever before.
Yeah, I was going to say, I noticed that theme has actually happened with the 2nd edition Pathfinder, D&D, and a couple other systems now, who are finding themselves kind of with this RPG renaissance that's been happening recently, thanks to, of course, the internet, and then certain shows. Critical Role is a big one. This tabletop show by Will Wheaton, creating a resurgence in board games. There's been kind of a new group, a new demographics coming into the game. So I think it seems like a lot of publishers and game designers have recognized that, so they've gone back and decided to make this more accessible than ever before, it seems. Is that something that you guys also thought of as well when you're doing this, that there's all this new media and all this streaming and things like that? Did ever streaming or stuff like that come into mind? Oh,
yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the world we live in right now. Critical Role is huge. The amount of people that watch the show every time it's on is amazing. My roommate is their biggest fan ever, for example. Yeah, it's definitely a thing. And when we were creating Wrath and Glory, we also wanted to reach out a hand to the miniature gamers. So, using D6 dice pools in the way that we constructed the way that the successes are counted, you gain an icon on a 4+, basically, on a D6. That was an easy way to sort of reach out to people who may have never tried a role-playing game before but are big fans of 40K and say, hey, Wrath and Glory is the game for you. We even have a starter set specifically to bring in new players. So yeah, our definitely accessibility was one of the big things in our mind when we were creating this game. I think there's nothing wrong with a good complex game. I mean, I know a lot of people love Pathfinder. I've played a ton of Pathfinder, D&D Third Edition. It's got a certain appeal to it. System mastery. If you ask any Magic card player, system mastery is definitely a part of the game for that kind of experience. But I think what we were aiming for was just something slightly different, and getting into a game where the system mastery didn't come so much from flipping open the book and looking at all that stuff, but more just having that information in front of you on your character sheet or on a card, and making it easier to get things done in the game. Let the rules get out of the way and let the story happen.
And each just has their own kind of valid place. I kind of wanted to say one of the things I prefer, obviously, is I'm a storyteller. I'm not totally about like roll cool over system, but I think each of them kind of has their own merits, because I've also have many a friend who are proud of their ability to understand a complex game or a system or create a really optimized build or something like that. And it's, fortunately, it's not a best or worst situation. It's the difference between Paul McCartney and Eddie Van Halen, right? If anybody here's a music fan, if you don't get that reference, Paul McCartney, Beatles, not the greatest guitarist in the world by any merit, but amazing songwriter, very accessible. Eddie Van Halen, amazing virtuoistic guitar player who's acclaimed by a lot of musicians as well. Also very famous in and of its own right? So each can have their own fans.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I like Dragon Force, for crying out loud. Talk about some guitar riffs.
Yes. So there's always seems to be a link between RPGs and guys who like rock and heavy metal. And I talked about this. I talked about this. Aiden Chan, who does RPG music and did some stuff for Critical Role. I've talked to this with one of the other Black Dragon or Red Dragon gaming. I'm sorry, I'm missing his name off the top of my head. But when you find out a guy is into RPGs and fantasy world, then you find out that they were into Metallica or into like heavy metal or power metal. I'm like, yeah, of course, it all makes sense, right? We all love that imagery and the power that comes with it. So did you get into the album covers? Let's not lie to ourselves, guys. I'm pretty sure all these 80s, 90s, and 2000s metal bands literally looked at like the red box and looked at the old covers, and they're like, all right, so I want that, but I want my guitar to be the sword fighting the dragon. And that's how you get an Yngwie Malmsteen album cover, right? So for something I wanted to know personally, and I'm pretty sure a lot of my listeners want to know now, and I'm not going to assume whatever your financial situation is, whether you're well off or eating hand to fist here, but it seems like right now a lot of people are trying to pursue things that maybe weren't thought as traditional careers, lawyer, doctor, whatever, accounting, maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago. Do you think the space right now for self-publishing or working in RPG content or storytelling content related to gaming, either tabletop, video games, whatever, it's a good space? It's viable for somebody to go in and make a living off of?
I would probably not ever suggest to someone that they quit their day job and do this full time. It is very difficult. I think the amount of full-time tabletop RPG designers is less than there are astronauts. It is not something that happens very often. The amount of openings is always, in my understanding, is that they're always the openings are very rare. They do happen. In fact, there was a posting not so long ago about I think it was Atlas Games is looking for a new RPG developer. So it does happen from time to time, but it is definitely not something that you should count on. And I would never recommend to someone that they just quit their day job and go do it all the time. But it is possible. Freelancing is a thing that you can do. A lot of people do it as a side job, as a side hustle, I think it's called these days. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. If you can make that work for you, that's great. I've done a lot of freelancing in my past, and I could go back to it if I needed to without a problem. And it's just this is. Self-publishing, I would look at as a way to supplement your income. I would not look at it as a way to be your primary source.
Mm-hmm. And it's still ultimately a passion project in the end.
Absolutely,
like. It's not a get rich quick, right?
Yeah. Those days are long gone, my friend. If you're going to do it, I would definitely look at it as like this is a hobby that may also make me a little bit of money.
Yeah. And I think it's also probably one of the easiest times to try that as a hobby now with Drive Through RPG, DM's Guild, and all the digital content. Yeah.
There's never been an easier time to just, make something and put it up on the web for people to have. That is absolutely true. It is slightly more difficult to build a large audience and get a lot of sales. That's the key point. It's like, can you do it? Can you self-publish? Yes. Easy. Not a problem. Will you see a big return from it? That's the hard question. Generally, that's going to be a really difficult bar to jump.
Yes, but for those of you out there who still want to try it, I think Ross kind of hits it on the head. Understand that you're never going to be rich off of it, but if the process in and of itself is worth it, then no better time than now to try.
Yeah, well, I will definitely say that I think most full-time RPG guys would also agree with me that this is a job we do more for love than we do for money.
So I know all the stuff you're creating, but what are you playing right now? What do you enjoy playing, regardless of system, medium? What do you like to do?
Well, I like to play a lot of immersive games like Fallout, for example. I like to I'm actually catching up on a lot of those cool superhero shows from the DC, like Flash and Supergirl and Arrow. I guess primarily I've been reading some David Weber recently and playing a lot of Dungeons & Dragons. I try to play as much D&D as I can because I got to admit I'm a little obsessed with 5th edition. I think it's just amazing and been having a lot of fun. I have a local guy who runs a Dragonlance game for us, and I hadn't thought about Dragonlance in 20 years, but we have done 4 sessions so far, and I just cannot wait. Literally cannot wait for the 5th one. I'm like, please, more Dragonlance. So yeah, we've been having a lot of fun with that, and of course, living in Colorado gives me the chance to get outside and go see a lot of really cool things in nature. We have Mount Evans and Estes Park and Crested Butte, and just tons of stuff to go look at and see. I'm looking forward to getting out of the house. I've been in the house quite a bit lately, dealing with work stuff. So it'd be fun to schedule a weekend and go just get out and go do things.
Yeah, I'm also really super jazzed that this kind of entire conversation's almost come completely full circle with you talking about beginning with your father getting into Dungeons and Dragons, and then here you are all these years later, indeterminate, undisclosed amount of years later, still back into it and still in love with it. I think that there's like a beautiful, if the life could have a story arc, there's already a beautiful arc to that.
Yeah, well. Thanks. I appreciate that. It is. I look at my life as something I've been incredibly blessed and incredibly fortunate along the way. I owe a lot of people who decided to give me a chance. And I'm very pleased to say that I feel like I've done a lot in my life, but it's definitely a blessing to share with other people my passion for gaming, and be able to do that for a living is just amazing. So I'm very grateful.
And if there's anything else you'd like to promote, I know we talked about the 40K RPG system, but if there's anything else you want to promote or talk about, maybe appearances or just how to follow you on the internet, this is your chance.
Yeah, I am at the Ross Watson on Twitter. You can find me on Facebook as well, and I have my own website, therusswatson.com, where I will occasionally post things, although it's been pretty quiet lately. And if you want to check out what me and my friends are doing, Evil Beagle Games is where we do a lot of little things like extra D&D projects, or we're coming up on a release of a big superhero game called Prowlers and Paragons, which is going to be a big deal. And I encourage people to check that out if they're at all fans of superhero role play. Prowlers and Paragons is a fantastic system, and it's going to allow people to really jump right into that whole comic book experience right off the bat.
And I second that. I love the guys over there. We also had a previous guest, Michael, who was on there from Evil Beagle as well. They're great people. And if you want to find me, my Twitter handle is at @classy_Don. That's DON. This is the MyRPG podcast, which you can find at Podbean, iTunes, or wherever you can subscribe to podcasts. Wherever you do, please do subscribe and leave us a review if you like it or if you don't like it. Any questions or concerns can be also sent to myrpgpodcast at gmail.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you at the table.
Remember, supporting the show helps it grow.